So you here, the advantage is easier.
It's wonderful. Thanks for everyone for joining us. We'll give it one more minute and then get started. Okay. Keep trickling in. Okay. Well, why don't we get rolling? Thank you all for joining our Technical Advisory Committee meeting number 2. As you all know, I believe, my name is Evan Mandel. I'm a climate mitigation planner here at the LCD. Kevin Young, our normal facilitator of these meetings, is on vacation until tomorrow. So we found somebody whose name rhymes with his, roughly. We are going to dig in pretty shortly on a few rules that the survey said folks wanted to dig in on. I encourage everyone to reintroduce yourselves in the chat. I think we all most of us introduced ourselves, but if you want to put your name and affiliation in the chat, just so if you don't know everyone or not everyone knows you, people will get a sense.
Sorry, Evan, I think that the chat, this is Kirsten, I think that the chat may be disabled.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, thanks for letting me know. Yeah, so if when you're first talking, if you want to introduce yourself and your affiliation, that would be great.
Chat's back open. Sorry about that.
Oh, great. What Evan said first. And did we want to record, Evan? You're probably getting to that.
I believe we're recording. Is that correct? Cody says thumbs up.
Yeah, it's recording and we're on streaming on YouTube as well right now.
Right. I know you're streaming. I just want to make sure about the record. Thank you.
We are in space and other places. Wonderful. Well, thanks for giving us some more of your time and wisdom. I know a lot of you have been to a lot of these meetings, and we've sandwiched them together in the time slots we've had. So thanks for all those who've come to previous RAC and TAC meetings. As mentioned, and as you've seen in the agenda that Cody sent you all, the bulk of this meeting is going to be looking at 4 different rules that we wanted to get some more feedback on, and then opening it up to a little bit more of, are there other rules that we need to talk to? Hopefully after that, we'll have time for a little bit of a break so people can stretch and eat and meet their needs in this 3-hour meeting. And then we're going to talk about housing and the integration of that and the Climate Friendly Equitable Communities program We've heard some concerns about that. So Ethan Stuckmeyer will be joining us for that conversation. We're going to look at the fiscal impact statement and get any thoughts people have on that, and kind of a broader conversation about implementation resources. And then we'll talk about next steps. So I do want to note a couple of things before we dig into the amendments. Well, participation guidelines. You all have seen these at previous things, at previous meetings. It's pretty straightforward. Casaria is out as well today, so Cody Meyer is the meeting host. So if you have any technical needs or troubleshooting, please message Cody. He is available. Feel free to get your needs met, step out, do whatever you need. Before we get into the guidelines, there are two things. One is I wanted to note that Cody has talked about pulling together a subgroup to dig into some details on 210, Rule 210. Do you want to say anything more about that, Cody?
Yeah, thanks, Evan. So good morning, everyone. Cody Meyer, Land Use Transportation Planner with DLCD. We have a number of folks who are really interested in further discussing Rule 0210, which is the Transportation Modeling and Analysis Rule. We had some really good conversation last time at the TAC and then on Monday at the RAC. So what we thought we'd do is just set up just a meeting with some folks who are really interested in talking a little bit further about this, make sure we're all on the same page, understanding each other, and try to get down to some proposed refinements to that rule to bring back, I think, here and the TAC. So I have a list of folks who I'm pretty sure I'm going to want to be there, but if anyone here is interested in attending as well, please let me know. You can chat me here on Zoom or send me an email, and we'll do some doodling and scheduling to do that. And I expect we'll probably want to set that up sometime over the next month.
Thank you, Cody. And I'd like to turn the microphone over to Alexis Biddle, our legislative coordinator.
Hey, thanks, Evan, and good morning, everyone. As Evan said, my name is Alexis, and I just wanted to give a little bit of context here and talk a little bit about the legislative background discussion that's kind of led to this rulemaking process and the Technical Advisory Committee we're all at today. And so specifically, Representative Lively and Senator Solomon has been working with the department, cities, and other advocates on a budget note that really is trying to set and a budget note is just a term that it represents kind of like not a legally binding piece of legislation or anything. It's just a setting of expectations from the legislature on how an agency is going to work on a certain issue or implement some item in a budget. And so we've been working on language over the last few weeks, and this language is not, we have not found a vehicle for it at the legislature. But regardless of where it ends up landing, it could end up just being a letter that we sign, that our director signs, sends to the legislature. We intend to follow through with this. So I'm just going to read this language, and one way or another, we're going to carry out the commitments that we set forth here, and just kind of setting the background and context for this Technical Advisory Committee. So the language reads, in implementing the climate-friendly and equitable community program, LCDC and DLCD shall collaborate with interested stakeholders, including local governments who must implement the program in their communities. Specifically, the Commission and Department must engage local governments and other stakeholders in efforts to amend or update program rules in the following manner. And then there's 5 buckets I'll go through. The first is to provide a process to consider input and expertise from local governments and other stakeholders by creating a technical advisory committee, the one we're sitting in right now, which shall provide the rulemaking advisory committee with input on technical elements of the CFAC rules while making allowances, considerations, and assessment provided in ORS 197040. input on how to coordinate the CFEC rules with other housing regulations related to statewide planning goals for housing under Goal 10 and urbanization under Goal 14, such as urban growth boundary regulations and Oregon Housing and Needs Analysis Program. And finally, also the input on associated costs for local governments to implement the rules. The second bucket is to ensure that the staff from the Housing Division participate in the CFEC, RAC, and TAC discussions to coordinate our CFEC work with our housing work. Third, we'll ensure activity and active involvement by the Director's Office in the rulemaking process to ensure transparency and accountability to local governments, the legislature, and the public. And for everyone's context here, Kirsten Palmer and myself are all in the Director's Office. And then fourth, we want to maintain a flexible timeline for rulemaking, which includes but is not limited to sequencing the rulemaking in phases, recognize the limits on local government capacity to provide input into administrative rulemaking processes, especially as the department undertakes rulemaking to revise statewide planning goals for housing and urbanization under Goals 10 and 14. And finally, it will continue to provide consistent and transparent Continue to provide consistent and transparent commission review to determine whether implementation addresses the CFEC program's climate, equity, and housing goals and is achievable by local governments. And on top, in addition to this, we'll be updating the legislature on the progress made in this committee and in this rulemaking in the legislative days this fall. So thank you and especially thank you for those that heard me do this just a couple days ago. Just wanted to set that expectation and kind of some guidelines for how our department will operate throughout this rulemaking process.
Thank you, Alexis. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, if there's any questions or anything, anyone wants to raise anything, happy to talk about it. But
yeah, does anyone have any questions about anything Alexis said? Damien, I see your hand up.
No, thanks very much for sharing that, Alexis. Without digressing and going down a rabbit hole about the legislature and what's happening, is the goal of the department to try to get this budget note attached to its own budget as an amendment to its budget bill?
I don't think so. I think this would be because our budget is already in the Senate and the opportunity to do that may have already passed. So it would be a bill that is yet to be identified, and it doesn't have to be. I think it's pretty open in terms of it could attach to many other bills, but
okay.
I think even supposing no more bills pass, we'll sign a letter, like we're going to send a letter to the legislature with this language. So one way or another, this commitment is being made by the department.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Before we dig in on the rules themselves. Okay. Not seeing any. Wonderful. So there were 4 rules that we wanted to get insights and opinions on that you all identified as things you wanted to weigh in on. And then we'll have some time for additional rules after that. These we talked with our rulemaking advisory committee on Monday. So we want to get your insights as well. The first is about definitions. We're proposing various adjustments and clarifications in the definitions section. They do what you can see on the screen there, just clarifying accessible dwelling units aren't just for people with disabilities, they're for everyone. Clarifying commercial parking lots, trying to bring that consistency throughout the rules about how we're talking about multi-unit housing, clarifying that parking mandate definition, performance measures and standards, and then clarifying that shared parking can be shared parking and not making there be hurdles on that shared parking that you have to prove that it'll work. Local governments can decide how to manage their shared parking definition. So that's really high level what we did in the 50 some odd definitions suggestions. There's one additional clarification. Sorry, when I said the parking mandate definition, one of the things we did is be clear that it doesn't apply to ADA parking or Oregon statutory definition of accessible parking, trying to make that flexible in case that statute evolves over time. It had always been in reference because we talked about parking spaces and the parking spaces exempted ADA, but we wanted to be super clear twice. So with that, Barbara, I see your hand up.
Yes, I was just wondering if maybe it might be beneficial to define in this section what you mean by parking lot instead of maybe in the rule. I mean, later in the rule instead of in 0124054. Just an idea to clearly identify that it includes the parking aisles, whatever you want to include as parking lot for that section. Describe it in your definition. You don't have a definition for it today. Just an idea.
Thank you, Barbara. I will think about that and talk to council about how they'd most likely prefer to do that. But yeah. Kirsten, I see your hand up.
Sorry, thanks. I just wanted to clarify the council is shorthand for legal counsel, not our city council, because we don't have one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, CEL or SEL, not CIL. Woo. Okay, Joseph.
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but and I'm not sure if this is the correct form, but I still want to see the correction to the definition for bicycle, the shared and protected bicycle facilities that we can include. As I mentioned before, the way it's written right now, it excludes cycle tracks, which is our city default standard. And I know the intention was to include cycle tracks, but the way it's currently written, it excludes it. So I just wanted to bring that up again.
Thank you, Joseph. And was it kind of garbly for a lot of people? Okay, so there's something garbly on your microphone, Joseph.
Yeah.
So I presume you will share other thoughts later on. So I don't know if you want to double check that.
Evan, could you just, since that was hard to pick up, it was this, could you recap what you think Joseph said was the shared definition for shared bike lane? I mean, it's a certain type of bike lane. I don't want to misspeak. And then I think there's one other issue, Joseph, you might want to put him in the chat if you, or Evan, do you want to recap that?
Do you want to try again, Joseph? Or
Can you hear me now?
It's still garbly.
Oh.
Yeah, so this is Bill, you want to summarize?
Yeah, I'll summarize. So we have a definition for shared or what is it called? Protected or separated bicycle facility. Maybe it's separated or protected. I can't remember, but and it's intended to include, and I think staff believes that it includes cycle track facilities as part of that definition. But I think Joseph has some concerns about some of the details of that definition, and we will work with ODOT. We've already started some discussions with them about directions we could take that that would maybe alleviate some of those concerns.
Zachary.
Well, thank you. I didn't want to get off track, but just to maybe add on to Bill's comment, we have taken a look at that, and from a from a technical point of view, and then sort of understanding DLCD's intent in that particular rule, the language for separated or protected would include the ability to include a cycle track.
Yeah. Thank you, Joseph, for typing it in the chat. Dan, I think you're up.
Thank you. Dan Reardon, Senior Planner with the City of Forest Grove. I have some questions about the definition of major. And what I'm looking at is definition number 20. Seems to be a lot of ambiguous terms in that definition that creates some concern, especially references to neighborhood needs, immediate neighborhood, significant land use or traffic impacts. I think the definition really needs to be tighter. And then in the parking mandates definition, I think it's definition 27, it references alterations and change of use. And I don't see that defined anywhere to clarify what's really intended there.
Thank you for those thoughts, Dan. Yes, I think that local governments sometimes have slightly different definitions of changes of use, and so it's we're somewhat deferential in that, but maybe we'll tighten that up. And if you have specific ways that you would tighten up major, not to add to your workload, but if you want to send us specific language or thoughts, that's really helpful for us to consider. I mean,
Sure.
We'll consider regardless. Yeah.
Happy to do that. Thank you.
Steve, I see your hand.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to just chime in and say that on the surface, reading the definition for separated and protected bicycle facilities, it's revised number definition 46. I strongly agree with what Joseph said, that the words there that physically separated that inhibit intrusion really sort of, I'm thinking about our existing urban built centers and how one would go about that. That language is very specific to the requirements of section 610, specifically 610-4B, and combining those together, I don't know if it's possible to comply with the language in 610-4B as modified by the definition 46 in this section inside some of our urban centers. So I think that's important to figure out the wording. I also want to agree with Dan on the definition of major. The definition of major, and then there's also a definition of major transit stops. They mean different things in the transit section. And major transit stops is a term of art that was applied in the TPR before these amendments. So now there's sort of some real confusion about the term major as it applies to transit stops and how that works. I think that's a real key section to get figured out. And frankly, I have not been able to figure out what it really means for Washington County for years. So there's a lot to that, and I can have a discussion with you if you want. I think it's a really key and important section to address. And then I'll limit it to, well, 4. The other issue in the definitions that I've discovered is there's 4 different definitions in the rules of horizon year and planning period. And these are found in definition 16, the current number 16, I think, unless it's changed recently. And then the new planning period, new number is definition 36. And neither of those jive with the definition in section 103. They're different. And then there's a significant modification to that period in section 145D is what my notes say. I think figuring that out is going to be important. I think either we figure it out or the courts are going to figure it out when somebody appeals the transportation plan. So I think that's a really key one to figure out. I don't have the answers, but I think all four of those are different and will result in conflicts eventually. And then my other one was the new intro section. The new intro section references 3 ORS sections, and I think section 303, which it references, is related to needed housing. And the term needed housing is only used in section 315. And there it's defined by a different ORS. So I don't know how much that reference to section 303 means anything or does anything. And then there's a reference to ORS 197.747. And when I looked that up, I found that that section of ORS had been repealed. So I would recommend determining what that intro section really means. And again, I forgot to introduce myself. My name's Steve Kelly. I'm a transportation planner with Washington County. And thank you for taking my comments. I can provide these in writing if you'd like, or we can set up a meeting to discuss and go over. But all four of those are sort of, well, and especially the first three are sort of critical. And just to recap, I think it's the section on separated or protected bicycle facilities, the definition of major and major transit stops, and the definition of horizon year and planning period. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for taking my comments.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. The Bill Holmstrom, DLCD staff. So just first of all, in general about Rule 5 and definitions, I think we all need to keep in mind that a lot of these, including the definition for major, predates our rulemaking efforts from the last few years. So, and continues to apply to portions of the rules, the portions of the division that apply across the state and outside of metropolitan areas. So, not saying we can't make changes, just that we need to be careful when we're talking about the definitions, particularly when around major, which there was a pre-existing one, that we're not making substantive changes to rules that apply outside metropolitan areas, which is completely outside the scope of what we can do with this rulemaking. I think we will be proposing changes to the bicycle, the separated and protected definition that line up hopefully more that are a little bit clearer, that addresses some of the issues that have been brought up. Yeah, please send us some writing on the horizon year and planning period concerns that you have, because I know we've talked about that before, and we tried to make some changes to get at some of that, but maybe we're not there all the way yet, and that's fine. We'll continue to work on that. And then the other piece you had was the preamble. So we'll double back with Department of Justice on that one. That really did come from council, and so we'll work with them to make sure that we've got the right bits there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Damian, I see your.
Thanks, Evan. Good morning, everybody. My name is Damian Cernick. I'm a senior planner with the City of Bend. And I also had a comment on the proposed changes to the parking mandates definition on page 8. I think it's lines 12 and 13. What I was going to recommend with respect to the amendments regarding residential development and a fee in lieu of providing parking is recommend looking at expanding that to include both residential and commercial. I think in Ben's example, we've had in our downtown for a while a fee in lieu of parking that people could pay. And I don't know how universal it might be among other jurisdictions that are working to comply with CFAC, but I wanted to offer that for consideration if that might be also something to include so that we did miss a type of development that should be given some relief from parking, especially if it's also through a fee. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback, Damian. It's certainly something that we considered, and I think that would be a policy change, which, you know, we can do some small policy changes in this clarifications and corrections rulemaking. So it's something we considered as whether that should be included or not. So we'll go back and talk with the team about it based on your feedback. If other people have strong opinions on that, whether fee in lieu for commercial should be or shouldn't be included, happy to hear that. Other comments on the definitions? These are all fabulous. I really appreciate the detailed look. Okay, I'm not seeing anyone else pop up. Maybe we'll move to the next rule. Bill.
Thank you, Evan. Again, Bill Holmstrom, DLCD staff. So we're going to talk about Rule 135 real quickly here. The change that we proposed to this rule, and let's just talk real quick. This rule is about the different levels of equity analysis that the updated rules require for certain actions. There's two different levels. Let me just get to the rule here, just make sure I'm using the right terminology. 135. There's either a major equity analysis or a engagement-focused equity analysis, which is not quite as much work as the major equity analysis. We, other parts of the rules had this rule before said what those types of analyses were, what they included, and then other parts of the rule said when you're doing this, you need to do this kind of analysis. When you're doing this other thing, you need to do this other kind of analysis. But this rule itself didn't really say when you use these kind of analysis. So all we did was add a section that just says it doesn't change when these happens. It just reiterates it from the other parts of the rule, that a major equity analysis happens when you're making a major update to a transportation system plan for an urban area of 5,000 or larger. And an engagement-focused equity analysis is conducted when you're making a major update to a smaller jurisdiction, TSP for a smaller jurisdiction, when you're making a minor update to a transportation system plan, when you're designating a climate-friendly area, or when you're choosing to, it's part of the authorization process as part of under Rule 830 for authorizing facilities that are certain facilities that are adding motor vehicle capacity. So those are the circumstances when you'd use these. The other parts of the rule, the updated section number is section 3, which talks about all the elements of that major equity analysis, and then section 4 talks about the engagement focused equity analysis. That major focus includes everything in the engagement focused analysis plus some other things. So that's what this rule does. That's what the change was about, was just to really point in the right directions, to clarify, so that you didn't have to look in multiple different places to figure out when you have to do these things. But it doesn't substantively change. It doesn't change when these happen or what those look like in terms of the proposal that we have right now. So happy to have any further discussion or questions or discussion on that.
Dan.
So yeah, I'm hearing the term major a lot here, and apologize if I'm missing something, but what exactly is a major equity analysis? As opposed to, there's another reference to an engagement focused equity analysis.
Yeah, so this rule is what defines what each of those are. And if you look at the updated language, it's updated section 4, talks about the elements of what the engagement focused equity analysis includes. And then section 3 says when you're doing a major equity analysis, you do everything in that in section 4 plus all these other things, A, B, C, D, E. So it's this rule 135. It's on page 10 of those draft amendments that talks about what those elements are. And we expect, Evan, you can chime in here if you'd like. I expect that we are going to be providing some guidance some guidance materials to jurisdictions to say, how is it you do these things? As part of the ODOT's transportation system planning guide update, that, this is a piece of doing a TSP update. And so I expect that'll be part of that as well. So there will be more information coming out about what these look like, what's the level of effort necessary to accomplish these.
Thank you.
Steve, I see your hand up.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? I had a change in my computer here. Okay.
Yes.
Just a technical comment on the proposed amendment in 135. The proposed amendment 135(2) sub B says when making a minor update to a transportation system plan as provided in section 105(4)D. When I go look at section 105(4)D, it creates a circular reference. It says conduct an engagement focused equity analysis as provided in section 135. So I think your reference there should actually be to section 105 sub 1 rather than 105 sub 4 sub D. That was my only comment on that section, is it seemed that there's just the reference was off. Thank you. Just a technical proposed amendment there.
Thank you, Steve. Other comments, questions, corrections? All right. Not seeing any. You again, Bill.
All right, thank you. So talk a little bit about Rule 630, which has to do with bicycle parking requirements. We did make a change to this rule as part of the temporary rulemaking. There was a formula. So the rule requires that local governments require bike parking for certain types of uses. And it sets a floor for bicycle parking in uses where motor vehicle parking is required. So there was a formula that we had in there that included raising the number of motor vehicle parking spaces to the 0.7 power, which is a number that we came up with by doing some research and looking at the literature about what made sense. And I think we heard from folks that might be a bit too esoteric. It might be a little bit too difficult to calculate that. It was a bit much, and it also, for very large parking lots, could result in a substantial number of bike parking requirements, which maybe is kind of out of step with being reasonable. So what we did is we changed the formula to be something that's is simpler to understand. It's just a certain number of bike parking spaces per the number of mandated motor vehicle parking spaces. It reduces kind of the number of bike parking spaces that would be required, depending on the size of the number of mandated parking spaces, and that we put a cap of just 20 bicycle parking spaces, so that you wouldn't have to do any more than that. Now, this is the floor for what local governments would then require locally. Again, this bit only applies if there's mandated motor vehicle parking, and so a number of jurisdictions have already or will be for some or all of their jurisdictions, not requiring motor vehicle parking anymore, not mandating it. So this provision doesn't even apply in those circumstances. It doesn't have to do with the number of built parking spaces if that's more than what's mandated, which is what we expect to happen in most cases. It only applies to when motor vehicle parking is required, then you would have to have some number of required bicycle parking as well. That's the change that we made in the temporary rules. What we heard in testimony to the commission, not really about that. I haven't heard any problems with that piece of it. People seem, if anything, people seem to think that was a good change. Is on the requirement for bike parking for residential uses. We've had a requirement that residential uses for 4 or more units of multifamily have bike parking requirements. That's across the state. It's been there for decades. It's still in the existing TPR that it still applies outside of metropolitan areas. What we've done with the updated rules is we added some additional requirements, including adding a requirement that there be 1 space per unit as a floor for residential, for multifamily residential. What we heard is that might be too much. And particularly, we've heard from, I think, particular affordable housing developers that said that may be that's an extra cost to being able to build this housing. It, like motor vehicle parking, isn't always used necessarily to that level. Not that they wouldn't want to provide any, but that it having that 1 per unit may be too high. So we take that seriously. We want to make sure that we want to not impede the production of housing. We want to make sure that we're aligned with state goals and on that. So staff is revisiting this, and we'll be bringing a revised requirement of that will be less than 1 per unit on this. So we don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet, but in the next version there will be a revision there, and happy to have any, if folks have questions or want to have discussions or what points that they want to make. Part of the issue here is also that we say the bicycle parking has to be secure and covered. We read that to be, secure means to have a place to lock a bike, not that it's necessarily indoors or behind a gate or anything like that. But people were reading it that way, so we'll probably want to clarify that a little bit, just to be clear about what the expectations are. And of course, local jurisdictions can, again, this is a floor. Local jurisdictions will be able to apply other regulations on top of what the rules require. So that's the direction that we're heading right.
Thoughts, questions? Ryan.
Yeah, thanks. Ryan Dyer, City of Milwaukee. Bill, do you anticipate, or maybe you don't know yet, that carve out that will reduce the ratio to below 1 would be just for affordable housing development or other types of development, or do you just not know the answer yet?
Yeah, we haven't come up with it yet. It would be all residential. I don't necessarily want to split that out in the rule about affordable, and then we have to define what that means. And I don't think we necessarily do that other places. So maybe we do in CFAs. I can't remember, but I think we probably just do all multifamily. All is probably what we do. But we haven't written it yet, so don't know.
Sure.
Be getting more information from the city of Portland's looking pretty in depth at this, and we may have some partners at ODOT as well. Steve, he went away.
There, my question on section is in 630 sub 4. Bicycle parking for all major transit stations and park and ride lots. There's a definition of major, there's a definition of major transit stops in section 5. I think there's a number of other places besides 630 sub 4 where major or possibly other attributes that might be related to those definitions, but I don't know what a major transit station is. And then for park and ride lots is rather expansive. I don't know if as a public entity, we're able to identify all of anything, but there are a number, or at least there have been a number of park and ride lots that are shared parking facilities with churches or even commercial activities where it's unclear, and those may or may not require a land use permit for the development as a park and ride lot. It's already a parking lot, and suddenly it becomes a park and ride lot through an agreement between the property owner and the transit agency or agencies, and gets labeled with a sign that may or may not even be in the right of way. So I don't know what to do there with all park and ride lots or all major transit stations, and would appreciate some clarification either in the rules or in the guidance on how our transportation system plan and development codes are to respond to those sorts of circumstances. Because frankly, I don't know. I'll leave it at that. I appreciate the opportunity here, and thank you.
Thank you.
And then I saw Phil. We mentioned the city of Portland, and there you are. Phil, you know what's going on.
I don't know if I can say I know what's going on, but I had a couple questions of clarification because we have had some local discussions going on. But I was wondering, I know we can't really predict if or whether House Bill 3414 is going to be moving forward at all, or if it changes at all. But that did have those provisions about, one of them was a waiver, I think, and it was a combination. I think there was ability to reduce bike parking to 0.5 spaces per unit. And then also, I think, possibly waive some development standards potentially related to the bike parking. And if that goes through, that's got a 10-year time frame. So I didn't know if there was any kind of thoughts on whether this should, keep that in the back there of people's minds, and or the other thing I was wondering about is I couldn't remember when this particular section is supposed to be effective, if this is supposed to be part of a TSP update, or if it had a different timeline.
Yeah, good question about the timing. I'm just trying to remember that myself here. I think I'll have to get back to you on that. It's either already applies or will apply at some point. I'll have to think about that a little bit and make sure if that's not clear, that would clarify that.
Okay.
Yeah,
one of the things we had with ours, was the 1 space per unit. We were actually more aggressive than that, of course. So I wasn't paying a lot of attention to that particular piece. But just to kind of from a City of Portland update, I don't know if we're going to have official numbers or usage, what kind of study we're going to do, but we've been having surveys of the development community and others about what types of regulations are potentially impeding residential development, and bike parking was something that got listed a whole bunch. And part of the reason why I'm asking about some of the timelines with this rule is because there's a push potentially that the feeling is that maybe we've gotten a little too aggressive in our bike parking and also a little too prescriptive with our standards. And so there potentially is going to be a push to possibly temporarily roll back some of our regulations, and or do that potentially in combination with maybe a more simplification about our development standards with bike parking, especially as it relates to residential development, because we were limiting the amount of bike parking that could be in a unit, and also put some standards on those. So I'm not sure we're gonna go on that, but one of the things I wanted to make sure is that if we roll back our our bike parking amounts, that we don't suddenly violate what's coming up in the climate friendly communities.
I mean, I don't know where you'll end up, but I think it would. I think it would be unlikely that Portland would be worse, or have both fall below the floor set by the state rules. Like you said, you have pretty aggressive rules right now, and even if you move them back, I think there's still wiggle room there. If we change that one per unit standard, which we expect to change, we are aware of the potential amendments in House Bill 3414. Is that right? 3414. Is that the right number? The legislature. There's uncertainty there about what's going to happen. So we're not hanging our hat on that's going to necessarily pass in that format. We don't know, but that's definitely a data point that we'll be using to figure out what makes sense moving forward.
Thanks, Bill. I've seen Julie, Christina, and Ariel's hands, so maybe in that order. Julie.
Hi. I just wanted to follow up on what Steve was talking about with regard to park and ride lots. I would encourage you to reach out to some transit agencies because I know a lot of the sort of agreement-based park and ride lots are essentially managed by at least in Salem, the transit district maybe reaches an agreement with, Walmart or some other retail location, and they, agree to have, essentially allow people to park and ride there. And I think that this requirement may be a barrier to such sort of cooperative agreements, but I would encourage you to reach out to transit districts about that.
Yeah, thank you for Julie for that. I think we can do that. I do want to note that this was one of those pieces that was carried over from the existing rule, which says actually uses even a different term for transit, all transit transfer stations and park and ride lots. So there's even more terminology there. So I mean that's still the rule that has applied for decades for where bicycle parking is required. In all these jurisdictions and all jurisdictions across the state. So not to say that we can't revisit it and address it, but I hear what you're saying, but
and I get it.
That's why it's there.
I get it. And there are so many components to the TPR that and there always have been. And I don't necessarily think that we want to continue legacy things that really can't be implemented or aren't enforced.
Thanks, Julie. Christina.
I wanted to echo the comment about the park and rides. I think that's pretty important, just because it's not achievable. And often in Springfield, park and rides are co-located with other uses and would be subject to bike parking standards from the other use anyway. I also want to just raise wasn't clear what the basis of the original prescriptive formula and the minimum number of bike parking standards was. It's also not clear what the basis of the new prescriptive formula is. I would encourage DLCD to think about us, instead of a prescriptive formula, please offer some sort of standard that local governments can interpret and determine if we want to use a prescriptive formula or something else. Springfield did a complete update in 2020 to our transportation standards in our code that were designed to implement our TSP to really reform our bike parking and to require a lot more bike parking than we had before. And it was based on a pretty detailed study in Eugene, Springfield of what bike parking is needed and what support is there for utilization of bike parking and what types of bike parking would help enable more bicycle traffic. But it was specific to Springfield and Eugene. And we based our recommendations on what the council ultimately adopted on that particularized study. But under these rules, we kind of have to throw that out if we have specific findings that, it's less than 2 spaces per 10 in a use where we're requiring parking. For example, we have a lot of timber mills in Springfield. There is a lot of employee parking associated with timber mills because where they're located, the transit doesn't go there. In timber mills, they operate 24/7 around the clock. So you have people coming to work at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they're not going to be, transit doesn't run at that time. And they're not going to be biking when they're coming into work at 2 o'clock in the morning because it's not safe. So there's a lot of parking that is provided and needs to be provided safely for those uses. But the requirement for bike parking to provide 4 for every 10 vehicle parking spots is just going to create a ton of bike parking that's not going to be utilized, and it's going to increase the cost of that economic development. Conversely, there are other places that we have required, I think, a lot more than this around requirement around bike parking. And we have really good bike parking standards in Springfield. We did, I think, a really good job of creating, long-term bike parking requirements, proximity to the employee entrances for that. Like, we've done a lot of work, and this is just kind of disregarding that and throwing a one-size-fits-all standard at it and say you have to do at least this. And I think that's not giving the right amount of deference to local government. So some other substantive standard that talks about maybe a safe harbor. This could be a safe harbor, but if we've done, sort of a particularized look at bike parking needs in our community, that should be allowed to count, and we shouldn't have to go through that process again and re-justify all of that again if we've already done it. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. And I think we're open to revisiting that that floor standard for when it's attached to the required parking. I mean, it's something that was in the temporary rules, and something we came up with. It's but for the kinds of things you're talking about, it's better than it was. But obviously we could adjust that. I just want to be clear. Aside from that residential requirement that I mentioned, all we do is we say you need to have requirements for these type of uses. So I think we do that already for most of these uses. We just say, as long if you unless are requiring the parking, the motor vehicle parking, and unless it's residential, which we expect to change. I think we do what you want, but happy to have more conversations with that.
I'm not understanding what you mean when you say it does what I'm seeing is one of the areas, if we decide to continue with parking mandates, one of the few things we would be able to mandate parking on is industrial and employment type development, around our mill use. And what I'm understanding is that this changes to subsection 7 would say that we have to have standards for those mill uses that are 4 spaces per every 10 mandated off-street parking spaces. And I think that's going to be potentially a mismatch to Springfield requirements, and we should be given the deference to figure out what's appropriate, especially since we've done it based on studies of what bike parking is needed and also will increase more by bike usage.
I tried to make that caveat. That's correct. I am saying for other types of uses around the city where you're not hitting that number. If you've got a different number, then that's fine. But like I said, we're willing to revisit that piece that we changed in the temporary rules.
Thanks, Christina. Ariel.
Thanks. Mine's a little more higher level, just kind of following up on the question around House Bill 3414, which I think the most recent version is developers can get an adjustment of any bike parking requirements with a floor of like 0.5 spaces per unit. And I just wanted to flag, and I don't expect this team to you don't have the ability to give an answer on this, but just wanted to flag for future conversations. That's just one of many requirements that our developers are going to be able to get an adjustment from under that bill if it goes forward. And regardless of what's happening with the legislature, I've been tracking the Governor's Housing Production Advisory Commission or Council when I've had a chance with session, and a number of things are on the table, including tree code. And I was going to ask about that at the end, but I had specifically requested that DLCD those conversations with the council, because what I told the subcommittee that was meeting yesterday is cities are in we've got competing priorities. Like, we can acknowledge that, right? And cities are in a difficult position. And that's typically what we use the local process for, is for what makes sense locally, balancing housing affordability, and development and our climate justice environmental priorities. But we're not, at least the legislative process has not been on this bill and others has not been kind of there haven't been table set. We haven't had the opportunity to have, thoughtful discussions like are happening today about what the implications are. So maybe this is more for Kirsten and the lobbyists listening, but like just really strongly urging that we're able, as these issues are coming up, that things like CFEC are considered. And I think my understanding and the intent of 3414 is that cities would not stop planning in the way that they feel is appropriate or that they're directed to by CFEC, but that developers get this kind of adjustment. But that's also a lot of work for cities to go through to then not be able to actually see the results on the ground. So just wanted to flag that, again, not expecting resolution in this conversation today, but hoping that we can have more conversations about that going forward.
Thank you. Thanks, Evan. Thanks, Ariel.
Thanks, Ariel. Seeing any more hands? Okay, thanks for that robust conversation. We've got one last specific rule that we wanted to flag for folks. And it's possible that those of you who wanted to talk about it are waiting to see the specific language that we come up with on this. But yeah, 415 generally talks about parking maximums, except some things that specifically apply in Portland and no other place. And we are working to clarify the reference to Metro Town and Region. Metro Long has had a map of those, and we referred to those in the rules, but we wanted to clarify that. So we're working with our Metro staff, having a meeting tomorrow to try to make sure that's squared up with the Region 2040 work. The other thing that we propose to do, and we did in the temporary rules, is removing this requirement that cities analyze and consider parking maximums based on 150% of their 2020 minimums. That's a pretty common approach that cities have done, but we wanted to ease the workload on our local government partners. So we are suggesting removing that proposal. With that, I will open it up to anyone who wanted to share comments or questions specifically on the 415 proposed changes. And I'm sorry that we don't have the precise language for Metro yet, but lots of people are involved in that conversation. Steve came on camera. Yeah, Steve.
I've been wondering and confused about the language in 415.1, where it talks about the Metro Title VI centers, corridors, station communities, and Main Streets adopted boundaries map. Is that what you're referring to as far as updating in that section to make sure we're referencing the correct map?
Yeah, that's correct. And as you know, some of those town centers are kind of blobbish, or are on the map, but the intent was to be a blob for further local refinement. And so that's what we're trying to dial in. We wanted to be clear that for anyone engaging what specific map we were. So we proposed putting a date in there, but we think we can do a more precise alignment of the Metro planning process, the local government partners working with Metro and working with these rules to make sure that we're getting just to those regional centers and town centers, not conceptual regional centers and town centers.
That would be great. Yeah, I also noted on the Metro does have that map available on their website, and the legend of that map uses different terms than are prescribed in this and other sections of the rules. And it'd be good if the legend matched the what's required for us, because we've been trying to figure out exactly which areas are affected by these, and haven't really been able to get there yet as far as just exactly what does this mean. And then I will point out that same language is also used in section 435. So a cleanup of both those sections as it relates to just the correct map that you're trying to reference would be very useful. I'll leave it at that for now and see if anybody else has any other comments. I do have other comments on 415, but I'm just asking a question related to what the process looks like here. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm hoping that we'll have something relatively soon, but a few councils and other folks are opposed, so I'll take a moment. Barbara, let's go to you, then we can go back to Steve if that works. Barbara. Barbara, you're still muted if you're talking.
Thank you. Within 415.1, I want to make sure that we're still just talking about cities with populations over 25,000. So even if you have a town center or one of these designations and you're under 25,000, this does not apply, correct?
That's correct. That was the intent, and that's how we read it.
Thank you. So if we've already applied parking maximums based on the requirements of the Metro Title VI, that won't change, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. We generally tried to align these pretty closely with what Metro's pre-existing parking maximums were, with the exception of adding some residential ones in. So there's slight tweaks here and there, but generally trying to build on the Metro work.
Great. Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate it.
Yep, you bet. All right. Steve, okay. Anyone else want to say any other things on 415? Steve, do you want back to you?
Thank you. Maybe others will have comments on following mine. Still in 415 sub 1, the requirement there is for the areas listed in section 0440. And those areas are based on existing transit frequency. And that is not something that's in control of the cities and counties of the Portland metro area, with mostly with TriMet and other transit agencies. And so it will, adjust regularly. And in my opinion, it's best practice for the jurisdiction to adopt a corridor where these land use controls apply, regardless of the existing bus service. So my recommendation, my request would be that can be defined based on the transit corridors identified through the transportation system plan, the priority transit corridors that are required in section 710. And then it doesn't shift on us whenever there's a transit service change. Not that we can't change the plan to respond to needed transit services, but that would be an adopted land use authority by the jurisdiction, as opposed to something the transit agency changed, and then the jurisdiction has to do something to respond to it. But it's a land use control that the jurisdiction adopts that the jurisdiction really doesn't have any control over. So that's my comment there, is related to 415 sub 1. And then there was a change that is proposed for, maybe it was adopted, was proposed for in section 110 sub 3, which says that counties shall behave as cities in response to these rules. And I could go look up the specific language. But we at Washington County are a county with a unincorporated population over 200,000. And that change in 110 would make this section no longer apply to a county. Section 2 would only apply to cities over 200,000. And my question is that intended? We've been assuming that these do apply to Washington County. I want to clarify if Section 2 no longer applies to us, which I think would be a good change. But I want to make sure that was the intent and that you guys are on board with that understanding.
Yeah, Steve, thanks for that question. You're correct that the intent all along with Section 2 was to apply to cities, not to Washington. Well, not to counties. It's kind of a more urban, big parking garages. I know Washington County is diverse and all, but really the intent was to focus on cities.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. I think we'd have some trouble with the requirements under Section 2. So that's very appreciated. Those were my comments. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. And certainly we'll consider that comment on parking maximums, at least after TSPs are updated, maybe just relying on the priority transit corridors section of 440. So on the consideration list, if other folks have an opinion on that, I know that the whole unifying of transit frequencies and what you all control has been a challenge under the parking regulations. So certainly understand that. Open to comments. Okay. Not seeing hands or questions. What just agenda wise, what I think we're planning on doing is kind of taking the next 15 minutes for things that aren't in the 4 rules that we brought to you before today that you would like to weigh in on and share your thoughts on, and start back at 11:45 with Ethan Stuckmeyer, our housing manager. I don't know his new title exactly, housing programs manager. Anyway, so yeah, that just agenda wise, that's kind of what we're hoping to do. Is 15 minutes of kind of open-ended conversation with you all, and then after that plays out, take a break, just to keep you updated. So I saw you come on camera, Ariel. Okay, I didn't know if you were raising your hand or wanted to. Yeah, we'll start with you, and then hear from Brock, and then Damian.
Thanks, Evan. So one thing that kind of came up for me from the last RAC meeting, so apologies it wasn't on your survey, something that Skylar from Tigard had raised about challenges with the EV parking requirement, and how the current rules aren't clear and objective, and that Tigard had been hoping to kind of do some kind of local code clear and objective version so they could administer it more administratively and not go through an open process with appeals and all of that, but that they've ran into a wall with that, a barrier, because building code already has statutory direction and rules and that supersede or potentially preempt Tigard's ability to do that. And so hoping that that's on your list to kind of look at. And then also it just kind of got me thinking, and this kind of relates to my earlier comment, because I was thinking about it as council. I think the developers that really want to dig into, just kind of maybe if we can have a conversation, whether it's in this rulemaking process or whatever, wherever it needs to happen time-wise. And I think it makes sense to have with the housing team and others as well, is what needs to live in these rules and what maybe makes better sense in other rules, or if they already do exist, like the building code EV parking example. I'm just starting to learn more about that. And I know that there's been, there's legislation and some of the climate package related to like green infrastructure and programs and resources and incentives for cities to actually do comprehensive green space, tree code, tree canopy stuff that I think we all want to see happen. And, where we can get more value, prescriptive or specific requirements, either in CFEC or in other rules, whether it's at DLCD or other agencies that it might be more appropriate. I'm not saying, preemptively that's what needs to happen with tree code or with EV parking. I'm not the expert, but just hoping we can maybe have some acknowledgement and understanding of those overlaps and where it's going to be easier and more efficient and more cost effective for cities to implement, and what makes sense to put in the land use process versus might be more simple or easier to implement in other spaces, other agency jurisdictions, other realms. Well, we're still going towards the same goals, but maybe doing it in a way that's easier to implement on the ground. And that's where, I've got to defer to my members, city experts who do this. They do this every day, bringing in different agency directives and figuring out how they just wanted to flag that, and felt like there was a couple examples that kind of supported that.
No, a fabulous comment, Ariel. Totally hear that. I think that we're raising the question from the city of Tigard to legal counsel to legal counsel conversations. We're trying to elevate that because building codes doesn't have a standard on how close conduit needs to be to serve a place. So they said, we'll defer to the locals, and some of our city partners said, no, that's not going to work for us. Or EV, as you all are aware, has always been this kind of where does it land, and the legislature generally gave it to building codes, but carved out this land use exception in the law that they passed in 2021. So we're trying to figure out exactly where that line is and whether local governments can do something to make sure that they do have a clear and objective standard. Yes, this serves this parking space. So conversations are being had among attorneys or are scheduled to be had. With the tree codes, I think we did learn on that as well. We did take the feedback from our local government partners seriously, that the maintenance stuff is probably less well fit in the land use bucket, and focusing on the planting at the point of development was something that was better fit there. So we are proposing to make that adjustment generally in the language that you've seen as well. So and we met earlier this week with ODF's urban forestry team, and so they're eager to partner with us in trying to figure out how to bring green infrastructure throughout. So I'm not mainly supposed to be talking here, I'm mainly supposed to be listening, but I did want to update the whole group on those, because I think they are well taken complexities in conversations.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe I'm just hopeful that we can have continued conversation kind of outside of the specific CFEC realm about these pieces and kind of what we see coming from the governor's office potentially when we see some of these recommendations make it up to the council. Because I just feel like there's not a lot of space for implementation discussions, and I feel like DLCD is one of the agencies that's at least closer to understanding where cities are coming from, and you're doing this work with CFEC. So I would just really appreciate being able to have the housing team and this team helping inform whatever we think might be going forward. And it's been a challenge for cities to be heard and seen as implementers. And I think that DLCD, I just would really appreciate the partnership from you all as we kind of continue these conversations, whether it's CFEC or otherwise.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ariel. Brock, we haven't heard from you, and then after you, Damien.
So I just had a quick question about 210. One, we appreciate the clarification that the UGBs are exempted. Question though, the two rules that are cited there at the end of 210 sub 1, 24-20 sub 1 and 38-20 sub 13. If this applies for UGB expansions generally, why is it just those two subsections that are referenced as opposed to those two rules as a whole?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think we, like Cody mentioned earlier, we're still working out the bugs in 210, and we want to make sure that we get that right. my understanding that those are the rules that talk about UGB expansions. And if we need to have a little bit different reference, we can do that. But there's other places in the division when we talk about UGB expansions. But happy to make tweaks to that if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think both of those rules in whole, the -20 and the -38, are both about UGB expansions generally. So I think just removing those section references, the 1 and the 13 after those would be more clear. Thank you.
Thanks, Brock. Damian, you had your hand up, and then Joseph.
Thanks. I had a question about the rule at 700 regarding public transportation system planning. The proposed edits on lines 14 through 16 now include cities and counties that must coordinate with transit service providers. And what I wanted to ask is, coordinate in this sense, are we still talking about goal 2 coordination, or is something greater really going to be required to ensure that we're hitting what the rule at 700 is requiring for cities?
Yeah, good question. What we're trying to do here is clarify for folks, especially folks like most cities don't operate their own transit service, right? You have to work with transit service providers that are operating separate entities, and this is really just to trying to get you to talk to coordinate. Okay. That's what we're trying to get at. If there's some other tweaks we can make to that language in that rule that gets at that better. Again, these 700 series of rules were a little bit difficult to write because the cities and counties most of the time are not the transit service provider. We need to make sure that we're doing planning that supports transit service in the community. So that's the balance we're trying to hit. We are very aware that you don't operate the transit. It's Cascades East Transit that does that, and so we just it's just a matter of that, trying to hit that balance. If we need to make some more tweaks, we can do that.
Okay, thank you. That was it. Thank you.
Excellent. I have Joseph up, and then Dan.
Hi, this is Joseph from the city of Hillsborough. Can you hear me this time? Good. Okay. I switched my microphone. Okay. I have 2 sections. One is the section 440. I know I had this conversation before with the LCD, but would like to switch the rail transit from 3/4 to half mile to match with TriMet's walk shed and other research that demonstrates that's the realistic walk shed, as well as switching the bus down to half to 1/4 mile. Again, is based on TriMet's walk shed and other research that backs that up. I also want, for section 440, it'd be nice to have some form of flexibility for smaller communities like Grants Pass and City of Cornelius, who built their cities kind of along highways that kind of, they're small cities with small budgets, but it basically kind of overburdens them to have a full on no parking mandate. And so that's something I just want to consider in 440. And then the other section I wanted just to mention is 445. Basically, there's 3 kind of different options for parking reform, and basically the options 2 and 3 are difficult for any jurisdiction to implement, and I'm not sure that people kind of feel that it was kind of intentionally written that way. So all cities are kind of forced to do a citywide no parking mandate. And so my suggestion here is could we incorporate like another option where a city can do a parking reform management plan that kind of fits with kind of the goals of these parking reforms, but a less prescriptive way but a way that cities can find with their the budgets that they have and the resources that they have to come up with a parking reform plan that fits with their community, but also allows their community input, which is what the whole CFAC rules are supposed to be encouraging, is more community engagement. But it's kind of rough when we go to a community and saying, well, your voice doesn't matter because the state already prescribed what parking option we're moving forward with. And so it's not an ideal setting if that's what we want to have it, where we can go to our communities and have a discussion about parking reform, and get their support for parking reform. And so the ideal approach would, and again, this is what Hillsborough asked for in the early rulemaking. It would be ideal just to have it where we set up a parking, allow cities and counties to set up their own parking reform management plan, but use this various different tools that are in this rule and other tools that are outside of this rule based on other research for parking reform. But anyway, those are my 2 comments, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Joseph. If you want to send along that research, happy to take a look at that. And certainly we are proposing to make some adjustments to make options 2 and 3 easier, and are aware of cities that seem to be going along those lines as well. So it's not everyone is choosing option 1, but thanks for that feedback. I have Dan and then Karen.
Thank you. Comments on the same section in 700 that Damian referenced. I also had a question about coordination, but that was answered. But I would like to say transit service provider. Is this intended to just be publicly funded transit providers, or transit providers that provide fixed route service? I think tightening that up would be helpful. And I really don't think that at the end of that section, referencing or referring to extent practical is really all that helpful. I think that's just too ambiguous. So that's my comments on that section.
Yeah, thank you. I think, I would need to go back and see if we actually define it anywhere, but our intent is that you include all local transit service providers providing regular service open to the public, wherever they get their funding from. So it could be private operators.
But it wouldn't extend to van pool service or
van pools or taxis or someone like that. No. Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Karen.
Hi. Hey, I wanted to just kind of echo what Joseph was saying regarding potentially integrating an option of developing a parking management plan, or looking at a management plan that might use pieces of each of the tools that are provided, but to be able to develop that in a thoughtful way that we interface, get public input. I mean, I speak from a jurisdiction that is very dispersed and kind of unique. Each area is kind of unique. So one of the tools, such as, removal of some of the parking mandates, might be correct in one place. There may be reasons why we want to use other tools in other places. But the current pathways don't really provide that option for us to look at it comprehensively. So I thought that was a very interesting idea to be able to sort of tackle this issue and what's appropriate locally. So I just wanted to support that concept.
Thanks, Karen. I appreciate that feedback. Matt.
I feel like, can you guys hear me okay? Okay. I feel like Millersburg is a little bit of a one-trick pony, as where we were going through the CFEC rules. We were really only asking for one thing: the ability to make a climate-friendly area be in a greenfield development and not in the middle of our existing city. And so as I'm looking at these, now that we have a chance to maybe tweak a few of these, I can go back to my original comment. And in section 350, where we talk about urban growth boundary expansions, it has a number of things that say prior to doing an urban growth boundary expansion, you have to designate a climate-friendly area, a CFA. And I'm wondering if there's any way we can possibly revisit making that say prior to or concurrent with a UGB expansion, because I'm looking down the road. We're only 3,000 people now, but 5,000 people is probably a couple years down. And when we do finally designate a climate-friendly area, I really think the only way we can possibly comply is to do it in the Greenfield area in conjunction with the UGB expansion. And so I know you've got this subgroup that's working on some UGB changes coming up here soon. I'm not that plugged into that. And so I don't know if that's part of the CFIC stuff that you're trying to cater to as well. But if there's any way we can tweak 350 a little bit to say, or concurrent with, I think that's really going to help us out down the road.
Thanks for that feedback, Matt. And we will try to capture that. If you can follow that up with an email, of course, Kevin is not here and he's kind of the lead person. So for our consideration on that, that would be fabulous.
Can do. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay. I don't see other hands up. We're halfway through 3 hours. I would love to give us a 13-minute break to stretch and meet our needs and come back at 11:45. Ethan Steckmeyer is scheduled to join us then to talk about housing and CFIC. Then we'll talk about the fiscal impact statement and resources needed for implementation and next steps. So thank you all. We'll see you at 11:45. we're just waiting a few minutes for people to come back and for Ethan to jump out of a meeting he's in to talk to us. Thanks, folks. We're still awaiting Ethan's arrival.
Hey, Evan.
Yes.
While we're waiting, do you want me to at least provide an overview of the bill for folks? Like a high level overview?
Can you do that in 2 minutes?
Sure.
Awesome.
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, so for the folks who are on the call, so what we're going to be kind of talking about today is in relationship, and I see Ethan's already on, so I don't even need to go into it. So
awesome. Thanks, Sean. Hey, hi, Ethan.
Hey, everyone.
The floor is you. Is you.
Is you.
Yeah, take it.
Lovely. Thanks, everyone. Sorry, I was joining a little bit late. I'm in a training today, so apologies for the background and all of that kind of stuff. But I'm here today to talk a little bit about the work that the Housing Division is doing related to the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis and how that relates and how we kind of plan the future of housing planning in the state to both complement and support and a little bit of a background on the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis for those who are not familiar, and we'll about how we see the ONA and dovetailing together as we embark upon a 2-year rulemaking process on the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. So with that, for those not familiar, the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis is a body of work that really started in the 2019 legislative session with House Bill 2003 that was seeking in some ways to reform the way that housing planning and Goal 10, statewide planning Goal 10 in particular, was implemented in the state to analyze a more realistic, more accurate sense of housing need in the state. That process has gone through years of advisory committee and technical committee advisory committees and stakeholder conversations about what that actually means and how that actually functions. In just this March, in the 2023 legislative session, the legislature passed House Bill 2001. What House Bill 2001 does, among many other things, it was a quite large bill, directs the Department of Land Conservation Development, Oregon Housing Community Services, and the Department of Administrative Services, particularly the Office of Economic Analysis within that department, to implement the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. Right, and fundamentally what the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis does is looks at housing planning a little bit of a different way than it has in the past. Right, housing planning in the past in the land use planning system focused more on housing capacity, or housing and land capacity. And the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis really functionally flips that process to focus less on that capacity of zoned capacity of housing and more on policies that increase the housing production, affordability, and choice of our local governments. And fundamental to the both moving away, further away from a process where we're just talking about levers we're pulling to meet our housing need, and more on empowering, encouraging local governments to take the actions that actually do incentivize and increase housing production, affordability, and choice. And I think as we embark now on a rulemaking process and the fundamental kind of implementation of Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, really feel like CFEC and ONA really fit nicely together to reach those goals of housing production, affordability, and choice in the future. So part of our work here at the Housing Division in the next biennium is to think through the ways that we can actually amend Oregon administrative rules to incorporate those kind of thoughts about how do we, through things like the housing production strategy, the housing capacity analysis, and buildable lands inventory, actually set ourselves up both as the state and as local governments to make the policy decisions that are collective goals to meeting our community's housing needs. And one of the kind of direct connections that we feel like is really, really important in that work is ensuring that local governments are rewarded, so to speak, or at least we're taking consideration in that Oregon Housing Needs Analysis process for the work that they're doing under the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities program to make other types of development choices more feasible and encourage those kind of infill developments, more housing within urban walkable areas of our state. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time kind of outlining where we as a housing division kind of go from here and how the work that this group is doing right now can actually be incorporated into that kind of work plan as we move closer to actually implementing this Oregon Housing Needs Analysis program. So House Bill 2001, obviously, like I mentioned, passed in March of this year, and that really kicks off a 2-year process for DLCD, kind of actually a 2.5-year process for DLCD and the other state agencies. So in July, this coming July, next month, LCDC is going to kick off a rulemaking process, initiate a rulemaking process for our agency to begin that rulemaking for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. That's going to include several things. That'll include an amendment to the Goal 10 processes in the state, which are particularly important for cities with a population above 10,000, but really the state at large. That'll focus more on how cities think more true, kind of more accurate depiction of housing need, and really elevating the work that cities are kind of already doing or already expected to be doing under the Housing Production Strategy program. And there's another element to that rulemaking work, which is mostly related to urbanization. So as cities are thinking about meeting their housing needs and taking actions that actually meeting their housing needs through their urban growth boundary planning processes. There are some things that we need to take into consideration in that kind of goal 14 urbanization process, which will include things like development ready lands. It'll include a better sense of what it means to actually conduct a buildable lands inventory as you're thinking about the existing and future capacity of those lands within an urban growth boundary, and really clarifying the amendment of a UGB when there is a bona fide true housing need that necessitates that change. And then third is related to kind of enforcement and accountability in that program. I think when we're talking in the context of the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities program and how that fits in with the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, I think one of the things that we really want to make clear in that process is that the work that cities are already doing to implement the CFEC program is credited, so to speak, for local governments in that kind of accountability system. They are stacking in that way the work that cities are doing right now to incentivize different types of development, commercial and residential development in a climate friendly area, is exactly the type of policy that is expected under the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. And so that process will run for the Land Conservation Development Commission is expected or required to adopt those rules by January 1st of 2025. And then the other deadline is January 1st of 2026 to implement or to adopt the rules for urbanization in particular. So the UGB work kind of outlasts the work of the Goal 10 rule adoption process. So before we move into some of the questions, I really want to ask you all in the room here if there are particular instances where you feel like it's important for our work as a housing division to incorporate those climate friendly and equitable community that work into this Oregon Housing Needs Analysis program. So I am very, very interested in hearing your thoughts on that element in particular, because right now we are only in the planning phase. There has been no rules adopted to implement the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. We haven't even written a word of them yet. So we are kind of just in the preliminary process and collecting the information that's necessary for us to make an informed decision on that rulemaking process. So I'll leave it at that. I see Sean has his hand raised, so I'll kick it over to him.
Yeah, no, and Ethan, that was a fantastic overview. And before we kind of move into those discussions and questions on like those coordinating issues that we should be aware of, I wanted to maybe talk, because we're in a room full of planning practitioners, about kind of some of the underlying principles or changes in like planning philosophy that underpin this policy, this set of policy recommendations, and how we expect that to kind of guide us in the rulemaking process. Because I think it's important. I think what Ethan pointed out was that this is a shift in how we think about and approach Goal 10 from a more kind of narrow exercise in accounting on land capacity, and much more towards focusing on the policies that facilitate housing production, affordability, and choice. And really, to us, what that means is that, you know, what we've seen historically in the planning for housing under Goal 10 is it was very much this kind of, you know, exercise in estimating the hypothetical capacity, you know, lands included in the UGB as kind of this check on urbanization and resource land protections that, you know, I think when you listen to a lot of the people who were around at the beginning of the land use planning system, that's how they describe the operationalization of Goal 10 is to be that kind of check force. And of course, like, obviously that dynamic is still going to exist there. But one of the pieces that we've really seen as very important in the context of housing production, affordability, and choice is, it's going to take an abundance of capacity that allows for a much wider diversity of housing types, housing sizes, housing characteristics, housing locations than what we have today to really meet the auspices of Goal 10. It's not just a plan, this kind of narrow hypothetical capacity, but really this abundance of capacity. And it's also going to take being very skeptical about the development conditions in which we would actually expect development to occur, right? And that includes thinking about the redevelopment potential of lands, thinking about, you know, how we characterize lands in our buildable lands inventory, going to be in our policies, being much more aggressive, and then are skeptical. That's going to be one of the intents as we get into rule. And of course, providing cities with the tools to make sure that they have a clear pathway in terms of getting through the Goal 10 and Goal 14 process. And that will include what we hope, at the outset, a very simple rule and a very extensive guidance document providing a lot of options. And then in addition to that kind of change in philosophy on the way we think about housing, there's also going to be this renewed emphasis, not just on like the zone capacity that you're planning for, but really what policies you are adopting at the local level to facilitate production, affordability, and choice. And that will be, taking this form of essentially providing a bunch of off-the-shelf policy options, right? To demonstrate that DLCD is a list of things that you could do, but you have to figure it out yourself. And so there's going to be a lot that kind of fits into that, as well as kind of standing up an accountability policy that ensures that we're taking meaningful actions to respond to needs that exist in our community that will all be wrapped up in this rulemaking process. So I did want to say that really quickly because I think it's an important point that happy to listen to feedback.
Thank you so much, Sean and Ethan. Can you each introduce yourselves, just your role at the agency for folks who don't know, and then we'll go to Barbara.
That would have probably been good, huh?
Yeah, I'm liable to do that even in front of legislative committees. So my name is Ethan Stockmeyer. I'm the Housing Services Division Manager, just recent.
Yeah, and my name's Sean Edging. I'm a housing planner at the Department of Land Conservation and Development.
Thank you both. Great overview. I've got Barbara, and then I've got a couple other people, Brock and Damien.
Hi, this is Barbara. You just said, Sean. The discussions about being skeptical about the redevelopment capacity of land. I hope you're looking at that in two ways, not only the way we've been thinking about it, but also perhaps how it's applied in the metro region. Not all and shouldn't, in my opinion. And the redevelopment capability of land may be a function of land cost, land value, not just an availability of bus services and a number of different things, not just where it sits in the Portland metro region or any other region. And so I appreciate you potentially looking at more factors than the ones we currently look at. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add too, since, the kind of initial inclusion of those languages around redevelopment and infill, there's been a lot of advancements in methodological techniques that enable a much more in-depth kind of nuanced look at like what can actually be built in a redevelopment context, what are the economic conditions necessary to facilitate redevelopment, including the policies that are applied at the local level. Those will all be considered factors under this, and really the intent behind the rulemaking and ultimately a guidance document that's provided to cities is to provide options on how you approach it, depending on the information that's available to you. So I think thinking about it less as like having one safe harbor, which we might have in say like Division 24, and really having a variety of options depending on the scenario that a local government is in, sensitive to their size, their capacity, the data that's available to them, etc.
Thank you.
Brock.
Yeah, and this kind of opens this pretty broadly, but looking at sections 8 and 9 of House Bill 2001, one of the things that it talks about is that ensuring that, and I'm just going to read it off here so that I get the language, housing production should not be undermined by litigation, regulatory uncertainty, or repetitive or unnecessary processes. And then section 9 directs DLCD to do some new rules and rule amendments related to housing and urbanization. So, and obviously this is a very broad discussion and there's a lot of things that could fall into this, but one kind of, what do you think the process would look like for identifying whether a rule in CFEC or otherwise has added complexity or analytical burden or regulatory uncertainty? And then 2, what are your thoughts about kind of the 2 sort of almost concurrent efforts to implement CFEC and ONA at the same time, knowing that there could be a bit of crossover, a few of which we've identified and we'll bring up in our comment letter, but also some things that ultimately will come up that we just have no way of predicting at this point, and how those kind of two will interact. I know that was a lot, so I'm sorry if I need to repeat it.
Yeah, sure. Let's start. I might need to ask you to restate some of your questions, but I do want to start maybe with the piece on that specific piece of legislative direction. The basic premise behind that is once we've done the planning for the housing that we're allowing, we've done the work related to needed housing, we've expanded our UGB, we've done all the planning, we've put in place the policies. It should be very straightforward to bring lands into the city, to get entitlements for development, to pull building permits. And it shouldn't be, kind of held up by, I think originally the wording was vexatious litigation, but the basic premise is that it should be easy to build on lands inside the urban growth boundary, right? And so a lot of the work that will be happening in relationship to that are kind of in relationship to like best practices and off-the-shelf policies. Like, for example, we know that a fantastic way to reduce the likelihood of litigation in, say, like either the subdivision process or the site review process is to do it through an administrative or ministerial process, right? Rather than going to public hearing where it has a tendency to daylight and increase opposition from potential neighbors, right? That's an example of how you could approach that. Same goes for annexation. Oftentimes these are processed through type 4 or even legislative processes that can get really contentious and heated at times and result in a lot of kind of legal fights, and of course add time and process to the actual development of housing. And so to the extent that we can look into those issues and identify kind of promising practices that would help, right, make that process smoother and make it not take, say, for example, 2 or 3 years to get to permits, is really the goal behind that statement. As to the second question, it's on kind of CFEC ONA coordination. Can you repeat what exactly you wanted to know in relationship to that? So my apologies.
Yeah, and this also kind of ties back with that Section 8 piece, but so are you concerned about how, like, for example, the deadline to designate and implement land use regulations for climate-friendly areas is the last day of 2024. The first day of 2025 is when the initial ONA allocations are the deadline for them to be released. And those just a day apart, right? We could end up with some cities that plan for a CFA based on their old determined housing need. And then a day later get a new determined housing need. Are they going to have to repeat that process now that there's a new housing need allocation for them? Are they going to have to make significant adjustments to the CFAs that they just implemented based on those new numbers down the road, getting into the repetitive process piece?
And that's a good question. It's definitely one that we want to be attuned to and careful with, and also one that the bill has considered and thought through, which is the idea that the commission has essentially been granted authority to, in instances where, say, there are already planning activities underway, that would, the implementation of this policy might kind of, frustrate by introducing this new set of numbers. It gives them the authority to, say, apply the old rules to those cities to avoid those types of like unjust outcomes where the work is already taking place. This would be an exact example of that. Of course, we think about this in the context of housing capacity analyses where Goal 10 work's undergoing. I think this absolutely applies to a process like CFEC as well. But of course, there's obviously going to be areas where we're going to have to be careful about overlapping, kind of deadlines and requirements that are associated there. And we're happy to talk through those. I do want to say one of the things that we're particularly sensitive to is this idea of, we're introducing this new paradigm that's really a long-term process and reshaping of Goal 10. It's not requiring any deadlines in the coming years. It's really tied to a city's ongoing housing capacity analysis and housing production strategy. And I think one of the intents that we have is when a city is going through their next housing capacity analysis, recognizing they've done a lot of work, right, in relationship to both middle housing implementation and the climate rules. And so we want to explicitly provide them credit for that and indicate like, hey, this is a huge body of work that you've already undertaken in response to these. So there's kind of multiple pieces that are, I would say, relate to that question. Of course, we're going to be happy to, be in tune and catch any of those as we can.
Awesome. Yeah, and for credit for ongoing work, just making sure that the work that gets credited is work that's specifically, there to help improve and speed up housing production. and not just like saying like, oh, you did, you know, a whole lot of other stuff with CFEC, but the housing production stuff wasn't there. So that's credit, but making sure that the housing production is the focus for that. Thank you.
I've got Damien and then Christina.
All right, thanks guys for your presentation today. I had 2 questions. So going forward, the rulemaking project, is this going to, and this is my words, which may be imperfect, try to mesh the direction you're getting from sections 8 and 9 of House Bill 2001 with section 350 of the CFEC rules, which deals with UGB expansion? Second question is, will your work be drawing on the recommendations that are coming out of the governor's Housing Production Advisory Council? Because I know they've got a framework that they developed a few weeks ago. I've lost track of where they are in their process, but I wanted to find out how you're going to be incorporating that thinking in your work. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, Ethan, if you wanted to take this on, please.
Sure. Yeah. So just from, I want to start from the base assumption that mesh is always a word that we're going to be using in this rulemaking process. So I think it's our job as both staff at the agency, but then also the rulemaking advisory committee to ensure that those policies that are already on the books and the policies that we're working to implement mesh together. And we will always strive for the ability to mesh those together. I think there's, you know, we haven't even really gotten into that point about, you know, how specifically those are going to work, but I don't think that that's an impossible task in front of us. I think it's very, very doable. And so we'll be striving for that at all times, and we'll rely on the folks in this room and in our rulemaking advisory committee in the future to ensure and guarantee that those things are meshing the best that they can. That is the job of DLCD staff to do that. And then on your second question on the Housing Production Advisory Council, just for context in the room, that group is working to get recommendations by the end of 2023. They are in the process right now, working in committees to work through some of those recommendations, prioritize, so on and so forth. I think we will begin our rulemaking process without the benefit of those recommendations. And really the intent of those recommendations is for the 2024 legislature, and not necessarily some of those recommendations will be for state agencies, and we'll try to incorporate those into the process and use the governor's office direction to advise some of that integration of those recommendations into all of the work that we're doing at the state agency or at DLCD and state agencies, not just CFEC, not just ONA, but all of them.
And if I can add just as an update to on HPAC, one of the things that we've been doing just as part of the, you know, staffing these groups, we've been responding to requests from folks on those work groups for information related to the ONA policy, so they understand exactly what we're doing in the next biennium, or roughly what we're doing in the next biennium. We don't have that much time, but and giving them an understanding of like, hey, there are places where there can be overlap and mesh between these two processes. For example, like, you know, a lot of the things that we are directed to do on things like, right, increasing permitting times or allowing a greater diversity of housing options. These are things that you know, these folks on the group are talking through, and we've kind of let them know, like, hey, there's going to be this very major rulemaking process. We have a lot of capacity and ability to develop a lot of off-the-shelf policies in response to direction from this group. So it's just something to keep in mind. So we don't know exactly what those recommendations will contain, but we've definitely been in conversation with them so they understand that this body of work is ongoing and that there's an opportunity for meshing there.
Right, and not reinventing the wheel, so to speak.
All right, thank you both very much.
Christina.
Thanks. So my question is, I heard some points from you, Sean, that talked about then this like idea of long-term reshaping of goal 10, you know, being realistic about redevelopment potential, being realistic about where infill will occur versus not occur, and making sure that we are setting up our regulations to allow more housing diversity. And I'm wondering, the way that I'm reading House Bill 2001, it seems to apply, you know, today, that these considerations due to prioritizing housing and not making housing harder. apply kind of to this rulemaking process. And I'm wondering what work is going on between different staff within DLCD to look at the requirements for climate friendly areas and how those may be very counter to those points that you were raising about being realistic about what redevelopment would occur and that potential. Because there's, from Springfield's perspective, you know, we allow a wide diversity of housing in our downtown area, which could include some dense single family ownership housing. But if we wanted to make our downtown a climate friendly area, it would preclude development of that type of stick on a realistic basis. Realistically, what development would come in and build there would not meet the density requirements. And so, you know, that we have some serious concerns. I know other cities do too, that the way the CFA rules are set up, they're so prescriptive that they're actually not allowing the desirable areas. And we're going to be, and it was specifically stated in the first rulemaking that this is a trade-off for long-term climate benefits in exchange for short-term or medium-term, even not even short-term. Instead of getting housing in the next 10 or 20 years, we're preferring to get denser housing later on. And that was so I'm wondering with House Bill 2001, are we re-examining that trade-off, or are we just accepting that, you know, we're going to be delaying some short-term development in mid-density ranges in some of these areas in exchange for later desirable high density?
Yeah, Christina, if I could speak to your question. So first, I'm going to start with the fact that as part of the housing supply picture, right, we know that we don't have enough essentially walkable mixed-use neighborhoods, which are going to be critical, not just for, you know, ensuring that we have a diversity of housing options for people that are close to where they, you know, live and work, but also that, you know, we can survive the century in terms of the climate impacts that are going to be coming our way, in terms of increased risk of, you know, a variety of natural disasters, as well as, you know, just in general, decreasing carbon output to mitigate further the extremely harmful effects of climate change. So I do think it's important to recognize that there's kind of an intrinsic connection that exists therein. I think, you know, based on I've read the rules a few times. I wouldn't describe myself as an expert, certainly not as much as the folks on this call right now. But everything I've read really suggests that the premise of what the rules intended to do is to essentially take a subsection of the housing that a city, you know, would have in their community and ensure that it is possible to have the conditions the regulatory would enable and facilitate a walkable mixed-use neighborhood. Sometimes that is not compatible with certain development patterns. For example, it's very difficult to make a walkable mixed-use neighborhood that consists entirely of single-family detached homes. And so I do think that there's going to be some trade-offs therein, but I also want to be pretty clear the piece that we need in the context of housing production, affordability, and choice is that we need an abundance of capacity, not just in 30% of our areas, but everywhere in our city, right? So, you know, I think to the extent that we can, you know, look at the rules and see those areas where, all right, are there trade-offs here? But I also want to say pretty clearly, a lot of these goals are very aligned. The same things that we need to address the climate crisis are the same things that we need to address the housing crisis, which is to build a lot of housing in walkable, dense environments. So with that in mind, I do think, you know, I kind of want to open this up a little bit too to Ethan and other folks in the call as well to speak to that. Ethan, if you wanted to speak to that.
I'll defer to Christina if she has any kind of follow-ups to your comments before.
Yeah, it's just, you know, and DLCD staff will speak to this, but when we raised this question before about how are you making sure that these climate friendly areas aren't making housing more difficult, they've said they'll defer to the housing staff in the later project to do that analysis. And you're deferring back now to Ethan and other, you know, staff in this project. So there's just sort of like this going on from my perspective. We've identified extensively some things for Springfield that are very prescriptive in the rules that we think will make housing harder in climate friendly areas and in non-climate friendly areas. And the response in the original rulemaking was sort of, well, you know, we need these in the long term, so it doesn't really matter, you know, that like in the long term, this will be so beneficial that, you know, it doesn't matter that you don't have this flexibility now. There are alternative review paths to the climate minimum density and climate friendly rules, but they're cost prohibitive. There's no money for any of this work. So we're not going to be able to do something that's more expensive because we don't have money to do the prescriptive thing, anyway, we're having to like not do other work that we need to do in order to do the climate friendly work. So, I'm just frustrated that it seems like there hasn't been a lot of coordination on this issue. Doesn't seem like it's great that you're in this meeting, but it doesn't seem like this is leading to any actual analysis of what's in the rules at a technical level, which we're in a technical review committee level, like we're not looking at the issue.
I guess what I'm saying here is you're asking me to change the rules that my staff members have produced, my colleagues have produced, right? And I'm telling you,
I'm not asking.
I agree largely,
Yeah, I'm not asking you to change anything. I'm asking generally the department, what's the response to House Bill 2001 now when it comes to climate friendly areas? Because I'm hearing different things from different people in your department. So maybe that's a question instead for matter for, if she's still on for Kirsten, but we're getting mixed messages here. And I think I'm not the only one that feels this way.
Sure. Yeah, Christina, I'll try to describe where we're at right now. So the rulemaking process for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis hasn't even begun. We don't even have authority from LCDC to, go out for recruitment of that group at this point. That said, we do have legislative direction from House Bill 2001 and direction from just legislators, for notes on the record and all of that kind of stuff on how that process should be completed and the goals of that implementation process. I think when we think about how we analyze and estimate housing need in our state, we are moving into a paradigm where we are looking at trying to accommodate more housing need than we have in the past, just because of the way that the methodology has been structured. And I think that kind of lends itself to thinking a little bit more broadly about what it means to provide housing for all people in our community, in our state. And so if we are focusing just on the ways that we have done it in the past, that's leaving a lot of opportunity on the table in terms of how the ways in which we can strive for meeting that housing need. Could it be in a situation where a city is focusing on certain types of development within a climate friendly area and focusing on other housing types outside of climate friendly areas? I think that's a possibility that is very real and something that we actually might encourage in the rulemaking process or the implementation of ONA, and thinking about how we can pull those, I would call them efficiency measure levers in our overall housing planning process to both incorporate all of the housing need, the entire spectrum of housing need, and still achieve the goals of the climate friendly and equitable communities process. I think we can do both and they're not mutually exclusive. But I don't have any specifics for you right now, just because we haven't even begun that process at this point in time. I don't know specifically how we're going to incorporate CFEC into the ONA process. It's just we haven't had the time to actually get that specific quite yet.
What I would strongly recommend is that maybe we pull back some of the CFA minimum density mandates right now, or readjust those CFA timelines so that we can take ONA into account when we're developing what those requirements are going to be. Because I think what we're going to do is we're going to go through this whole process, and then we're going to realize that we're not necessarily helping housing, or it's not tailored to what we need to do under ONA, and we're just wasting a lot of local government resources to write paper plans that aren't going to move the needle, and we're going to have to redo in 3 years under ONA. So that's really my biggest concern. Like, I totally get that ONA that's a rulemaking process that hasn't started yet, but in the meantime, this is a really housing focused heavy, CFAs are really housing focused, and there's a lot of very prescriptive requirements, and we've got concerns, and there's no information in the, either rulemaking record that says our concerns are, we've got different people think different things are going to happen, but there's really nothing you can point to that says this study shows your concern isn't valid, or there's a lot of, well, we think we can accomplish everything in a balanced way, but as our, as local governments, we're saying we're really concerned about We're really concerned about right now sort of taking any options off the table, even if that means 15 units per acre and on an undeveloped lot in downtown Springfield. That can't happen under CFA, the way the rules are written now, unless we go through a really extensive, difficult adoption process that we can't do. So I think that's part of the concern, is really take a look at those timelines, maybe. If you can't take a look at the standards, take a look at the timelines and just make those mesh, because right now it's really challenging.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And fortunately, we're in a position right now with the ONA rulemaking process to be, we're fortunate to have the resources that we feel like are necessary to do those kind of analyses, have those conversations, and really kind of get down in the weeds with folks to try to make it sync the best we can, knowing that these come from different directions. We're trying to take this approach of meeting both our climate and housing goals as a state, and I think there's a way where we can really coordinate that in a way, and we've got those resources available to our department to really meaningfully do that work. So I look forward to that work, and with you, Christina, and other people on the call in particular.
I'll provide some comments in writing about some facts about what's going on in Springfield right now and why it makes it difficult to do. We would love to have an 8-10 story tall building in downtown Springfield full of housing, that we don't have market comps that will support that on the private development side. And so what we're going to be doing is basically a development moratorium in downtown Springfield for any greenfield development on some sites we have vacant. So I can explain a little bit more about that in some written comments.
Thank you for doing that, Christina. Thanks for that robust conversation. We're pretty much out of time on the housing linkage conversation on our agenda. Anyone have a quick last word they want to throw in before we transition over?
Evan, if I could, I just want to say that I appreciate the folks on this call and all of the conversations that we are continuing to have and about to have on this coordination between CFEC and ONA and all of the other things that DLCD and local governments are focusing on are critically important. We all share the same goals, right? We share the same goals of meeting our carbon emission reduction targets. We share the same goals of housing the folks who need it in our communities, and there are ways to do both. And we look forward to having those conversations with you all in the next coming months and years. Thank you all for the time today, and I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Sean and Ethan, for joining us. All right, I'm going to transition it over to fiscal impact statement. Matt.
Yeah, so I'll take this part of the discussion for a little bit here. Matt Kroll, the Planning Services Division Manager here at Department of Land Conservation and Development. And so talking a little bit about fiscal impacts, economic impacts of these rules. And when we do that, I think we can talk about them on sort of two levels. There is a broad question of what does it take to implement the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities program, and what's the cost to local governments from a whole range of different pieces in these rules, the rules that were adopted back in 2022. And that's a good discussion for this group to have, this technical advisory group, and we'll be having it not just today. I think this will be a continuing piece of the discussion that as this technical group gets together in the future. There is also a second way of talking about it, and it's a much narrower, more specific way, the specific impact of the amendments that are being proposed right now. And then in that case, we're comparing those amendments to the rules that were already adopted in 2022. So not talking about all of it, but what would this amendment do? We are required through the statute that's mentioned on there on your slide to prepare a fiscal impact statement to talk about the impacts just of this rule amendment, to really look at the economic and fiscal impacts of that. So it is much narrower. And in our discussion with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee earlier this week, several people pointed out to us that the impacts of rules are not just fiscal and they're not just economic, and that there's all these other kinds of impacts too. Absolutely true, very important. And when our commission is making decisions about rules, they're interested in hearing testimony on all the different impacts of the rules, and they consider that as part of their decision-making process. But the fiscal impact statement itself, this particular document that was in the packet that went out to the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and then to this technical group too, It is more narrow, and it does focus just on those economic questions, which unfortunately kind of makes it sometimes into a tough document because one, it tends to be sort of a negative document, talking about there's costs to the rulemaking, when in fact there's costs and there's benefits, but the benefits aren't always economic or fiscal. And then also it leaves it hard because in many cases it is difficult for us to say to make an estimate in a specific dollar amount of what an economic or fiscal cost would be. We may think there is, but because these rules and these rule amendments are indirect in their effect, in that they affect how cities and counties make decisions based on these rules, we don't know just what decisions cities and counties might make in these rules. And then that has effects on businesses or on the public or individuals. So in some cases, we have to say in our impact statement, well, there's a potential, or that we don't think there's a potential, but we're not able to put a real dollar amount on it. So with that in mind, I think we would open the comments here and ask for people, if you've had a chance to look at the section, if you have specific sections you want to comment on, it's really helpful certainly to know what page number, what section, where we may have missed a fiscal impact or a cost, where we may have overstated or understated or something like that. We want to hear from that. I would say that just broadly speaking, these rule amendments are intended, we're hoping to set them up so that they reduce the fiscal impact to cities and counties as they implement, to make it easier to implement. If anybody spotted parts of the rules where our amendments that are being proposed would make it harder to implement or would increase the fiscal impact to cities and counties, that's something that we very much want to highlight and want to hear about, so that we have a chance to, since the rules are not been, the drafts are still drafts and are still evolving, there's opportunity to change that. So that's my way of introduction. And I think at this point I could turn it over and let's hear from members of the committee.
Thanks, Matt. And thanks for Cody for posting the link to it. Barbara, I see your hand up.
Yes, I just want to say that I appreciate that you're taking the time to do this fiscal impact analysis and asking local governments how the amendments that you're working on right now affect local governments. And I think overall you're correct that they are more helpful than not. I think one of the issues that some of us local governments have is that the rulemaking in the first place didn't adequately address how the rules affect local governments, despite local government comment about how they would be affected. And so to say that the amendments are less worse, that's true. But without having the first analysis, it is difficult to really address how much better or less worse these options are. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Brock?
Yeah, I would echo Barbara's comments there. But from the housing side too, having an analysis done to see what this would do to housing costs and housing production was something that we have been trying to get done since the beginning of this RAC process, and it never happened. And, we think that just on the initial draft of the rules that got adopted, there are going to be significant impacts to housing because of them. And so to see this new fiscal impact come back and say, hey, because the parking mandates are going to be delayed a little bit, that's going to delay housing production. When, from the initial fiscal impact statement, all we got was for a 2,000 square foot house on a 6,000 square foot lot. We're not anticipating any price impacts, but that's not really even what the rule regulated. So to come back and see that change, that, just the parking amendments, extending that deadline is going to slow housing production, I think is insufficient to address the whole impacts, one of the rules as a complete piece, but two, just as these amendments, because I think, the clarifications about the UGB expansions not being required to do the VMT analysis on 210, that's going to help increase housing production. So I think those offset. So that's kind of where I'm coming from at it.
Thanks, Brock. Certainly, I would acknowledge sometimes that our requirements under the Administrative Procedures Act aren't exactly forcing us to ask all the right questions. Yeah, so there's some mismatch that can happen there. With that, I'm not seeing other hands right now. I would turn them. Thanks for that presentation. Feel free to send in written comments as well to the email that we've posted in the chat. I would pass the mic over to Cody Meyer, who's going to talk about the resources needed for implementation.
Thank you, Evan. Hi, everyone. Again, Cody Meyer with DLCD. So yeah, we just want to have an open-ended discussion here, talking about the costs and needs to implement the rules. So I'm really just kind of looking at the plan changes, not necessarily the projects and things needed to see the outcomes of the rules intended. And just to kind of frame the conversation, I just wanted to give a quick overview of what our funding program is to date and invite Teresa Conley, our colleague from ODOT, to provide a couple minutes on the ODOT specifics of that. Hey, Teresa. So I'll just say high level here is to date, DLCD and ODOT have about $19.5 million to support local implementation of the rules. Some of that does include things like model code and some guidance and things that the state will be, need to do to help local governments do that. So it's not 100% all going to go to cities and counties, but the majority of it, I think it's safe to say it is. So within that pot of money, we're really talking about DLCD in this biennium budget. We've been spending a little over $810,000 doing the CFA guidance, hosting peer exchanges, paying for the CFA studies that are due at the end of this year, doing some of the public outreach plans and some of the community engagement activities that would be associated with that. DLCD has also been providing a lot of guidance and staff time and technical assistance to support local governments. And then as far as the rest of that money was really, the ODOT Climate Office has a piece of that, and that's really focused on the scenario planning in Eugene Springfield, Salem Kaiser, and then the performance measures in the rules 900 series rules to kind of come up with performance measures and targets to track local actions towards achieving their greenhouse gas target. And then the biggie, which Teresa's here to talk about, is the TSP amendments, which will be ongoing through the end of the decade here. And then a lot of the nitty-gritty work that Zachary Horowitz is going to be leading on this 210 conversation and coming up with the performance standards and a lot of that kind of deep, wonky stuff that we're going to figure out and support on. So Teresa, you want to give a quick overview of your program?
Sure. And as Cody was talking, I was kind of scrolling through who is here. And so this is probably old news to a lot of you. But if you have new questions or another thought pops to mind, please chime in. So as Cody had alluded to, there's a bucket of funding that ODOT has to support CFEC implementation writ large, just that 15 million that you've heard about. And that funding supports my time, Zachary's time, several projects developing guidance, including updating the TSP guidelines and internal development review guidelines, as well as Zachary's analysis procedures manual modeling guidance update. In addition, that multimodal inventory that we're really excited to hopefully kick off soon. We're in negotiations right now with a consultant team. And so all of that work aside, we have funding also for the TSP updates. And I'll share my screen. Let's see, right here. And just share a few slides. These will probably be familiar to several of you on the call because I know I've been in conversations with you before. So we're setting up a new program separate from the TGM program that you are all familiar with because this is significant and unique work. And we also want to track how much it costs in reality. We can create estimates, but we want to track how much it costs to produce this CFEC compliant TSP update. As you're all probably very familiar, most jurisdictions are required to update their TSPs by 2029. And so this also helps us take a programmatic approach to that work. And I've had ODOT staff has had one-on-one conversations with each jurisdiction to make sure timing works for those jurisdictions, with the caveat, the asterisk of we recognize this is ever evolving, and so things can shift over time. But we want to have a pretty good sense of where jurisdictions land for the TSP updates. And so I'll pop over to the next slide. See if I can make that happen. Okay, I think this is the next one. So as you're probably familiar with, and I earlier mentioned, I think this will be a unique programmatic approach where jurisdictions will be funded similar to if you were to receive TGM funds. But instead of the application process, we just say, does 2026 work? Okay, let's target that time frame with about 6 months leading up for contracting, et cetera. There will be a 15% local match, and that can be in kind. And of course, you can overmatch if there is extra, if you want to put extra emphasis on a certain area of the scope. We're looking for efficiencies, definitely. So where we can group jurisdictions together, we will be using the existing TULIP price agreement that you all are likely familiar with. And we are working still on a statement of work template that can be a foundation for each jurisdiction's TSP, and then alter it as appropriate. And then I have the schedule as well, but I don't know if we want to get into that. Cody, is there anything else that you were hoping I would touch on other than just the programmatic basics?
I think that's great. Yeah, thanks. I just kind of wanted to set the stage here. So I've been in touch with several of you. Teresa's probably been in touch. Just want to say, please contact us if we haven't had our conversations with you yet. Teresa's budget is a little more friendly than that. She doesn't have to renew it every 2 years, so she's got that. And we have our budget for this biennium running out at the end of this month. We're in conversations to get some more to support local implementation, and I think our commission and our agency is committed to going back in future biennium for budget requests. And so we just kind of open the floor for folks to share what their implementation needs might be. And when you're answering that question, it'd be really helpful for me specifically if it's kind of a DLCD, zoning, parking, kind of a DLCD wheelhouse, is just flagging for like what biennium you think you might be doing the work. We've been having a lot of conversations and finding that a lot of cities have or will be requesting some alternative dates that put them outside of our next biennium budget. So it's just really helpful for us to just get a sense of in which years we might be anticipating meeting those needs.
Thanks, Cody. Thanks, Teresa. Joseph, I see your hand up.
Yeah, this is Joseph off the city of Hillsborough. I just want to reiterate a concern that I have. We have section 350 1A, and I know that applies for the local jurisdictions outside of Metro, but it requires that the TSP be updated to comply with the new CFAC rules. But we have another local jurisdictions right now working on their housing needs analysis. They're going to be looking at having to do a urban growth boundary expansion under in these rules, and in order to address housing needs. And so I can see that being a hindrance because it's going to take 2+ years to update the TSP. At the same time, ODOT has this funding plan that's kind of all spread out, but if everyone's coming in all at once because of their housing needs analysis, that may mess up ODOT scheduling. The other one, just to highlight, as I mentioned before, I think it's section 833B, that one that requires that the TSP be updated to comply with CFAC before consideration of any new roads that are more than 3 lanes that either widens or extends the roads or modifies or adds an interchange. And so, and that applies to even the local jurisdictions in the metro area. So I'm just, and if those parts of the rules are still in play and jurisdictions are coming in with UGB expansions or having to modify their comp plans, et cetera, I can see a lot of a need to all of a sudden have everyone's jurisdiction to be an update right now to comply with CFACT. And so it's I mean, there's two concerns. One is just like, okay, is ODOT ready to have everybody come in once for funding because their plan is basically spread out? And the other one is like, are we actually going to delay housing needs and economic development based on these CFACT rules?
Yeah, so Joseph, on one of your pieces around the UGB expansion, we actually have a proposed amendment in Rule 12 that would delay implementation of that piece till the end of the decade. So that kind of covers that piece of it. I don't remember exactly what the other piece you were talking about was.
I think I haven't seen the amendment yet for 350, and is it directly in 350? Because I was kind of trying to keep an eye out for it.
It's in Rule 12. It's in Rule 12, Section 5, subsection F is the new subsection.
Okay. I'll dig around for that one. Or do you have it on the screen right now?
Yeah, Cody's highlighting it for me there.
Okay, so that really addresses that concern. The other one is just the 830, I think it's 3B.
And in relation to that one, Joseph, that's one of those areas where I had the asterisk ever evolving. 830, an 830 project triggers a major TSP update. And if that comes up, well, hopefully.
Did we lose Teresa?
I think we lost.
She froze for me too. Yeah, I mean, Joseph, I think there's an interim kind of problem there with that provision as well. And I think we can look at doing something to address that.
Sorry, I think I said it wrong. I think it's 2B, not 3B.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this on Monday too, and I think we said, yeah, we probably could do something different there to adjust that, at least in this interim period where people don't have the updated TSPs yet.
I have Karen and then Steve, and we're getting close to the end. Karen.
Sure. So I know that I've spoken with folks about this, and since Clackamas County's kind of scheduled time was way out, like in 2028, it didn't really align with our needs because our transportation system plan needs to be updated in order for us to relook at our projects. And that needs to happen in the near term. So we're going to go ahead and move forward outside of the sort of funding rubric. But what may be helpful to us would be to have a small pot of money that could support the land use elements that are related to CFAC that are within the TPR that we will be doing as a part of the major TSP update. So it's not that we would be looking for funding to fund our whole TSP update, because that's $1 million+ dollars. But perhaps there is a small bucket of money that we can really be doing to being able to use that will be needed to update our zoning development ordinance. And so I don't know if you have thought about that with regards to being able to have something accessible to those jurisdictions that are choosing to self-fund their TSP updates, but need some sort of financial assistance for the other zoning elements. And I'd say we were really fortunate and successful to be able to access funds through DLCD for community outreach for some housing amendments. And that process worked really well, right? We were able to access about $50,000, $100,000, really that was focused on community engagement to be able to talk about that. So it's that type of thing. And I think you had asked about timing, is we would be interested in having access to that money, likely in 24, 25, so in the near term.
Hi, Karen. My internet dropped out partway through, but I think I got the gist of your question, and I think I answered the prior question. I heard a desire for funding if a jurisdiction is self-funding their TSP, but to do incremental parts of the CFAC implementation. And I'm also flagging if there's a separate 830 analysis that needs to occur leading into a TSP. So questions about whether the TSP program or a different funding pot could help support that work.
Yes, basically. So for those that are kind of like outside of the schedule, and not requesting the full amount that would have been allocated to them in a future year? Is there maybe smaller bits that could be used to supplement the work that they are doing, specifically related to the zoning changes that will need to be made to comply with the CPAC rules?
So most likely, yes. I want to say yes, but I'm going to say most likely. So that's exactly what I'm asking for, and that is something I want to follow up with you on. The window is right what we're building right now. And I just want to make sure that I coordinate with Metro, and I don't know if you applied for the Metro planning grant, but would want to just kind of double check with them as well. But let's touch base offline to get a little bit more information.
Yeah, and I do think the Metro planning grants are very focused and are not necessarily transportation related.
Okay.
Steve.
Yeah, thank you. My concern with the funding and the timing actually for the regions in the Portland metro area is related to the next cycle of the regional transportation plan update, when there's a number of TSPs that will be adopted in the region, in the metro region, that will have the new financially constrained rules, and the development of the project lists for the next round of the regional transportation plan update. I'm not sure if anybody's thought through those sort of timing considerations and the potential need to update transportation plans to have some kind of financially constrained list in order to have projects in the regional transportation plan. That's one of my sort of how do we manage and navigate this process questions that I don't really understand yet. The other one is the impact of section 831 sub C and redoing transportation plans to comply with those rules. That's a huge and considerable expense for a number of communities. Beaverton was trying to grasp with that issue last week. I haven't had a chance to circle back with their staff, but I'd be interested to know what they're estimating compliance with that is. They were mentioning several Washington County roads within Beaverton that would be potentially needing that additional analysis. But there's a number of roads out there that are, you know, county area and other other places that will be updating their transportation plans, and it's not going to be this sort of clean one city in isolation circumstance. And how we navigate these pretty significant expenses with updating transportation plans for as we process through these cycles. There's, you know, maybe a bunch in Washington County of needed 830 analysis based on just that subsection. And I mean, we're talking millions of dollars, plural, within the Portland metro region, at least. We've done some back of the envelope, what it might mean, but we're not sure. And trying to figure out just exactly what those costs will be. And the problem I think that we have with it is these are already on our adopted plan, and they were put there by our board for a reason. And doing the evaluation again is simply, it feels like a paperwork exercise that's going to cost millions of dollars, require considerable public engagement, and end up with a similar outcome. It's just tough. So to really understand what's going on there. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. I thank you for having this process, and if you guys have any wisdom for me on either how that RTP is going to shake out or how to deal with the financial aspects of 830, let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. if you'd like to share any back of the envelope things, you're always welcome to send those along for our consideration. Or you can send the whole envelope, not just the back. So we're pretty much at the end of our time today. And before we go, we wanted to talk about next steps. First, of course, there's the commission hearing in July. This rulemaking will be on Friday's agenda, July 28th. We don't know time certain yet, but of the 3 LCDC days, that's when it's scheduled. And it will be the public hearing on the proposed rules. We've long been planning to have a rulemaking advisory committee in August and possibly a TAC. We don't have a date certain for that, one or more, maybe a couple of different meetings in August. But the question we wanted to throw out to you all is, and before the commission meeting, possibly in late June or very early July, does it make sense for us all to get together again? We gain a lot from these meetings. If there is a lot of things that we haven't covered in corrections and clarifications, we'd be happy to carve out the time to meet with you all again in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So that's kind of a question for you all. I think the easiest thing to do, I'm not seeing the reactions button. Yeah, is to go to reactions and a thumbs up or speak to it. We just wanted to get some feedback from you all of, hey, yes, we would really like to meet, and here are the things that we'd love to cover before the commission hearing. So thoughts, feedback. Yeah, I'm not seeing a lot of I'm seeing a couple of thumbs up, a hand. Damien, you want to say something?
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Just briefly. So in terms of making this meaningful and work with your schedule, with the commission hearing taking place on the 28th, when would you need to have any kind of final input from the TAC that would be incorporated in the commission's packet for them to have time to review? Would it be the 14th or the 7th of July?
I think earlier.
Okay.
Probably the last week of June.
Last week of June. Okay.
Yeah.
Evan, could I clarify your question was to meet again sorry, this is Kirsten Green, Deputy Director of the LCD. Was your question to whether the TAC would like to meet again before the commission meeting?
That is the question.
Mm-hmm. And I think Damien asked a good clarifying question, which is the LCD staff know our internal deadlines predate packet by
so
a week or two too.
Yeah, we'll need to have a set of draft rules that will be going to the commission and will also be part of the notice to the Secretary of State by the end of this month. That's not to say that we can't make more changes or that we couldn't bring something to the commission with additional changes at their meeting. Try to avoid that as much as we can, but if that's necessary, we can do that. And obviously, they're going to hear lots of testimony. We're going to continue to have probably some additional meetings throughout the rest of the summer and into the early fall. And by the time we get to November, we could have additional changes. So nothing's written in stone until they actually do the adoption in November, just to be clear.
Thanks, guys. Evan, you're seeing the conversation in the chat. So folks are suggesting after the packet's out even.
Certainly, we can consider that suggestion. I understand that, and might be a little bit easier for us, given that a couple of us are on vacation next week. So it's hard to juggle all these things with the commission meeting, and Kirsten.
But I think that folks probably need to peel off its one, but great job on all this, everybody. Thank you very, very much. Evan will give the official thanks, but just grateful to be able to listen in to this conversation. But if we can kind of pat down the draft for the commission, given all the guidance we've received at TAC and RAC meetings, and, you know, focus on that, because you guys have received, you know, 4 meetings worth of comments. Then, you know, at TAC, if we have a TAC before commission, probably the week before commission, that would allow you to kind of do a slide or carry any other thoughts from TAC members that could have come in post packet. I know it's not 100% smooth, but we're always, I know that everyone on this call is used to finding the best way forward, if it's not always the perfect way forward. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right, we will let you all know when that is. Thank you so much for spending 3 hours of your day with us. I know your time is valuable, and we really appreciate the partnership and your insights. So thank you for your time. We'll be in touch. Always feel free to reach out to any individual staff or the DLCD CFAC email directly, and a lot of us will see it. So thank you all. We will see you at the next meeting.